Hi, I'm Matt Murphy. I am Senior Vice President of IBISWorld's North American Client Services Division, and today I'm joined by Vlad Khaustovich, who is one of our Senior Research Analysts. And what we're going to be talking about is a topic that IBISWorld has been getting a lot of questions about, a topic that probably has a lot of people refreshing their web browser to see what the latest headlines are, and that topic is tariffs. How are tariffs going to impact my business? How are tariffs going to impact the businesses of my clients? These are the types of questions IBISWorld has been fielding, and I thought it would be good to just sit down and talk a little bit about tariffs in general and what IBISWorld sees being the most affected industries in the U.S. economy. If you're not already familiar with IBISWorld, we are essentially the largest provider of industry-level statistics and analysis there is. We also report on hundreds of industries in other geographies like Canada, China, Europe, Australia. So we did really want to focus on, what industries IBISWorld sees as being the most positively or negatively impacted by tariffs. Before we even get into that, though, Vlad, I think it'd be good to give everybody a little bit of background. Can we start by just talking a little bit about how we got to where we are today with tariffs?
Yeah, sure. So to set the stage, I would like to give a brief overview of the recent history of tariffs. As you can see from the timeline, the first wave of tariffs came in 2018 and mainly targeted manufacturers from China. Between 2018 and 19, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on different products like steel and aluminum. At the same time, the US signed a new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada called USMCA, which removed trade barriers within North America. And later in the period, we saw the Biden administration retaining most of the tariffs, but also imposing additional tariffs on China, specifically products like electric vehicles and computer chips. So overall, tariffs have been actively used over the past 7 years, but the main difference between tariffs back then is that they used to be targeted against China before, and now they apply to most US trading partners, including China. Fast forward to 2025, tariffs increased a lot. Aluminum tariffs went up a lot. Now they're at 25%. Steel tariffs were capped at 25%, but now they apply to imports from all countries, removing any previous exemptions. The Trump administration imposed additional tariffs on automobiles and auto parts, which impacts even such companies as Ford, which are very US focused. There's also now a 10% baseline tariff, which applies to nearly all imports, as well as 145% tariff on imports from China. So with all of these tariffs in place, the key question is, how are these tariffs impacting the US economy? And to answer this question, it's important to understand what products the US exports, who buys these US products, and where the US imports come from. So when it comes to imports, most goods come to the US either from Mexico, Canada, or China. What's interesting is that China used to be the largest source of imports prior to 2018. And then following the trade war with China, Mexico outpaced China. And so Mexico now represents the biggest source of imports in the US. A lot of goods that are imported into the US are consumer-oriented goods, products like laptops, toys, apparels, auto parts. And these are the type of products that are often produced on a mass scale, and they benefit from low labor costs. The composition of US exports tends to be a little bit different. First of all, when we look at the value of exports, we see that the US exports fewer goods than it imports, which causes the US to operate at a trade deficit. And trade deficit is one of the reasons for the US trade policy. When it comes to the main consumers of US goods, Canada and Mexico represent the main markets, while China is lagging behind a little bit due to a combination of being in the trade war with the US, but also being able to fulfill its domestic demand internally.
So Vlad, we know that there's these industries that are importing these goods themselves. So there's going to be businesses that are directly impacted, their bottom line directly impacted by tariffs. And then as you go down the supply chain, there's probably a host of industries that are going to be indirectly impacted. Can you start by talking a little bit about the industries that we think are going to be the most directly impacted by these tariffs?
Yeah, sure. So when we look at different parts of the US economy, we see the biggest impact on three main sectors, which are agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. Within the agricultural sector, we see the largest impact on soybean farmers and cotton producers. These two industries specifically generate a lot of revenue in foreign markets and specifically in China. So they have very high exposure to counter tariffs from China. When we look at the manufacturing sector, tariffs have the biggest impact on auto manufacturers and steel producers. Even companies like Ford, they rely on imported auto parts, so they're still exposed to tariffs. The Trump administration recently announced some relief for US auto producers. However, their exposure to tariffs still remains high, and there are some reports indicating that the price of new cars may go up by at least $2,000 and up to $10,000, depending on how expensive the retail price of a new car. And when we look at the mining sector, the level of exposure varies. For example, coal and copper miners rely heavily on foreign markets, and at the same time, they see little competition from imports. So these industries are exposed to counter tariffs. We see the oil and gas extraction industry being involved heavily both in imports and exports. So this industry will see a high impact of tariffs as well.
So those are those industries that are the most directly impacted. How about some of the industries and sectors IBISWorld sees being more indirectly impacted? Some of those industries that maybe aren't in the headlines quite as much as, say, agriculture or manufacturing.
Yeah, so the US economy is very interconnected. So tariffs impact more than just manufacturers. For example, ending the de minimis rule has a high impact on low-cost retailers like Temu and Shein, whose entire business models are based around duty-free imports. At the same time, even the US-based retailers like Amazon and Walmart sell a lot of products that are manufactured in China. And now, as we know, there's 145% tariffs on goods made in China. So even the US-based retailers are being impacted a lot. Tariffs also impact the transportation sector as demand for imports falls. For example, the Port of Los Angeles expects a 35% decline in cargo shipments from China this week, which could potentially lead to fewer jobs. And there are other industries like professional services. High uncertainty creates additional opportunities for firms like consulting firms and lawyers and tax accountants. But a lot of projects today are centered around assessing risks, costs, and the impact of higher prices on demand.
I think that last bit is where IBISWorld certainly comes in, helping some of those consulting, accounting type of firms. So we know directly impacted, we've got, manufacturing, we've got mining, we've got agriculture. Indirectly here, we've got retail industries, transportation industries, and professional services. Let's put the industries aside for just a second. How does IBISWorld see tariffs impacting the consumer? How does IBISWorld see tariffs impacting just the average American household at the end of the day?
Yeah, consumers are ultimately the ones who pay the price of tariffs. And knowing that the US imports a lot of consumer goods from China, the price of consumer goods like laptops, smartphones, apparel may go up, which may ultimately lead to higher inflation. So far, we haven't seen tariffs impacting the economy and consumers a lot. There was an increase in consumer uncertainty recently. However, employment and inflation levels remain reasonable. We saw the GDP declining slightly in the first quarter. However, the decline was driven by an influx of imports as businesses rushed to stock up on imports ahead of the tariffs. But also we see consumer spending going up, which is a good indicator. So even though the outlook may not necessarily be super optimistic, it doesn't seem to be very negative at the moment.
Okay, well, that's, I guess, a little bit reassuring. You mentioned earlier the Port of Los Angeles. There's certainly industries that are being impacted. We just talked about the consumers. How about certain geographies within the U.S.? So something like the Port of Los Angeles, we know is going to be impacted. Are there particular cities or states in the U.S. that we see benefiting from, potentially being harmed by tariffs?
Obviously, some places will see the impact of tariffs more, such as seaports on the West Coast, including the Port of Long Beach, which these places already are seeing the impact of tariffs as cargo shipments from China are declining. Areas with heavy reliance on manufacturing jobs like Detroit and Cleveland may see the impact of retaliatory tariffs as well, which may ultimately lead to lower employment levels. But overall, the impact of tariffs on specific regions depends on which industries are concentrated in these regions and how those industries are being impacted by tariffs.
Thank you for that, Vlad. I think that's really insightful and gives us a really good baseline for the industries that are going to be impacted, how it might impact the average person's wallet, and maybe even some of these pockets of the United States that you just talked about. As far as ways in which IBISWorld is talking to its own clients about tariffs is really just using it as a way to open up conversations. So whether you're a business owner yourself or you're somebody that works in that professional services sector that Vlad was talking about, maybe you're an accountant, a consultant, a banker, and you're working with clientele in a wide variety of industries, just going in and being able to ask the client about their exposure to imports. Where are their goods coming from? Are they going to be paying more for those goods based on tariffs? What is their game plan for that? Are they planning on passing those tariff costs along to their own customers? Are they planning on eating those costs? If they're planning on passing the cost along to their customers, does that mean that they are forecasting, slower sales growth, for instance? If they are planning on just eating the tariff costs, is that going to negatively impact their profit margin? So just trying to understand what your client's game plan is or hatching one with them can go a long way as building your credibility, having your clients see you as a trusted advisor, and at least start the conversation a little bit. Some things that probably don't get talked about as much is what are tariffs impact going to be on a business's spending? Obviously, if sales are going to slightly decline or profit margins might be a little slimmer, is that going to change the business's spending or hiring habits? Do they have exposure to, say, exchange rates? We know that the dollar is fairly high right now. That could definitely impact the cost of goods in addition to tariffs. And then lastly, is it a business that's exposed to interest rates in some way? I think it's safe to say that just a few short months ago, a lot of folks would have guessed that interest rates would be steadily coming down here in 2025. But to Vlad's point earlier, if we see that tariffs are keeping inflation steady or potentially growing inflation again, the chances of the Fed lowering interest rates is going to be pretty slim, or it's going to be pretty infrequent. And that's just going to affect borrowing costs for businesses in all industries at the end of the day. So definitely don't be afraid to open up, talk to your clients about what's going on in their industry, talk about their game plan for addressing tariffs if they're impacted by it. As far as IBISWorld's response to tariffs goes, each of the industries that we report on that are exposed to tariffs will, in the at a glance chapter of our industry report, have some key takeaways about tariffs, addressing the impact of tariffs on that particular industry. We also have available for download on our client site a tariff tool, which can help you just identify the risks associated with tariffs across all the different industries we report on. You can even get in depth on the different HS product codes for each industry and really just understand at a more micro level what the impacts of tariffs are going to be on certain goods and, of course, the goods that feed into those industries and downstream to the consumer. Vlad, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat about this with me today. I hope everybody that was joining us got something out of this. If you do have any questions about tariffs or different industries that you're working in, do not be afraid to, if you're an IBISWorld client, reach out to your client relationship manager or contact us at ibisworld.com. Thank you.